Right, so thanks for coming. This is about some of the work we're doing on other cultures and other languages. If you just take it slightly too. So there are about 6,000 languages in the world, and basically any typically developing child can learn any one of those languages. A lot of them are disappearing as children start to learn the kind of languages of the state, like English or Spanish or Chinese. But still, there are many, many, many children learning a whole range of different languages. And languages differ in very interesting and important ways, and in ways which are extremely different from English. So one of the ways in which languages differ is in tone. So in the sounds that you make. So let me just see. No, wait a minute. So in Chinese, if you say ma with a flat tone, it means mother. If you say ma with a high tone, it means horse. So the tone is actually part of the word, and obviously it's pretty important for children to be able to distinguish the word for mother from the word from horse. And you probably do know about the Khoisin languages, the Xhosa languages of Africa, some of which have up to 22 clicks. And each click is part of the word and makes the word mean something different. Now, we don't really have either of these things in English. So it's sort of surprising to people that you can have sounds that actually are part of the meaning of a word, as opposed to the way it works in English, which is to do just with the intonation pattern of a sentence. Then meanings vary enormously in different languages as well. So in English, we care about whether something is on a surface or in a surface. But in Korean, they're much more concerned about whether something fits tightly or fits loosely. So we would say the apple's in the bowl, but they'd just say the apple loosely bowl, because it's not tightly fitting in the bowl. And another way in which meanings vary, and this is really important to children learning other languages, is in politeness. I don't know if you remember when you were a child, but this awful problem about what do I call her? Do I call her by her first name, or do I say Mrs. X, or do I say oi I say, which is what my brother used to call grown-ups when he was lost for words. So in many languages, you have to actually change the words you use as a function of who you're speaking to. So if you're speaking to somebody of higher status, you have to use a different set of words than if you're speaking to somebody of lower status. And in other languages, you have to mark your relationship. So if you're talking to your mother's brother's father, it's a different word than if you're talking to your mother's sister's husband. So these are things that children have to learn. And politeness, you all know about say please, say thank you, but that's really minimal compared to some of the politeness terms that children have to learn. And finally, languages differ enormously in structure. So in English, if you say mouse bites man, it means something radically different to man bites mouse. It matters very much both to the man and the mouse which way round it is. But there are many languages in which the word order doesn't really matter at all, because you've got these small things we call inflections that you can put on words which tell you who's the doer and who's the done to. So when you think about, the reason we're interested in all of this is because since any child can learn any language, we know quite a lot about how children learn English, but we know virtually nothing about all these other distinctions. And obviously, if we did understand that, we'd understand much more about what the basis of language acquisition actually is. So one fundamental issue for children is what somebody is actually talking about. So supposing there's a rabbit and a mother, and the mother says, "Look, a bunny." How does the child actually know what the mother means, what she's really referring to? How does he learn what the word bunny refers to? So this poor child could think, does she mean the carrot? Does she mean the bunny's ears? Does she mean the bunny cuddling? Or what does she mean? And what researchers have worked out, that what's very, very important to this is something called the 9-month revolution, which is when children change from perfectly good interaction one-on-one with people, where they can exchange sounds and laughs and smiles, to what's called shared reference, shared intentionality, where they understand that they're sharing some common ground which allows them to interpret what the other person is saying. And these are the signs of this 9-month revolution, when babies start to share attention, when they are able to give things to people and to show them, and when they're able to point. And this is a very small little film, which I'll just show you. And at a point where I show you, you'll see a perfect example of joint attention. So this mother's playing with this baby. Oh, damn, sorry. This is very awkward for this. With the toy. She squeaks it. He looks at the toy. There. That is an example of joint attention, where the two look at each other and they know they're sharing enjoyment and attention to this toy. And here what's happening is that mother and baby are looking at the same thing. The baby's pointing, and he knows that she's looking at what he's pointing to. So this is a way in which you establish common ground, and that forms the basis for working out what somebody's talking about when they're talking to you. So if this is important for language learning, then it's extremely important that we establish that it happens not only in middle-class societies in the middle of Manchester, but also all over the world. And there have been a number of studies recently which have been looking at exactly this. This study I was involved in. This was a study, a naturalistic study, where we were filming children in the east of Nepal and also in Germany. And we were coding for things like reaching, requesting, offering, pointing. And what we found was that in both societies, which could not have been more different, babies were reaching and requesting and offering by about 8 to 10 months. They were all pointing and imitating by the age of about 1. And this was a semi-experimental study which basically found exactly the same thing in rural villages in Peru and India, and then in a middle-class township in Canada. What was interesting about this was that the children were reported as starting to understand words at about 9 months. But the Canadian children were reported as starting to actually use words 3 months earlier than the other two. And we think that's because in the Canadian society in which these children were growing up, mothers were talking to the children all the time, this is not the same across the world. So some things seem to be, that the sort of setting conditions for language seem to be there across the world, but there are differences, and these differences become more important later on. This is a very interesting study where a friend of mine called Penny Brown looked at children learning to talk in Mexico in the Tzeltal communities and in Rossel Island, which is the furthest out island of Papua New Guinea. And the two societies could not be more different in the ways in which they interact with children. So the Tzeltal people believe that babies are very, very, very fragile and vulnerable. They need to be kept very calm, and they're talked to in low voices, and their whole kind of environment is very peaceful and calm. Whereas in Rossel Island, babies are surrounded by people all the time, and they interact with them by sort of saying, hey, hello, hello, and then they shake their arms, and then they jiggle them up and down, so it's extremely high activity rates. But what's interesting is when you look at the babies and you ask how much do they interact, how do they initiate interaction, you find that they're doing it at almost exactly the same rate. So it seems like babies start out very similarly, and then the culture kicks in to sort of bring them up to be members of their own cultures. So if that's the case, how do other cultures think about children learning to talk? Well, they differ quite a lot, in fact enormously. So some people, some cultures, think that you really have to teach babies to talk. And their beliefs, so one culture in Papua New Guinea, believe that babies start off basically being part of the animal world. So they talk about babies talking like birds. And you've got to pull them away into the human world by actually teaching them to talk. In other cultures, people believe that there's absolutely no point in teaching children to talk. They'll learn on their own. And what's the point of actually kind of throwing language at them like us middle-class people do? You might as well just leave them be. Now, what's interesting, I'll talk about these learn on their own children in a minute, but in these cultures, although they say that you have to teach the children to talk, they're still actually only teaching them to talk about what they're interested in. So what parents do is they wait for the children to be looking at something or to be protesting about something or to be wanting something, and then they say after me, give me that, or say after me, don't do that. So the basic format of sharing the child's interest and sharing the child's focus of attention is still there, but the language, the whole belief of how to teach them is different. So this is quite interesting because we know quite a bit about how children learn language when they're spoken to a lot and when they're spoken to about what interests them. But we don't know much about what actually happens to children when they're not spoken to as much. And on the one hand, and this is really important because in our culture, children who don't hear a lot of language tend not to do very well. They tend to be behind compared to children who learn a lot of language. But of course, that's in our culture and adjusted for our culture. There are ways in which children manage to work out language and meaning without necessarily hearing a lot of language directed at them by parents. So one thing we don't know very much about is how much children can learn from actually just watching and listening. They must be able to do that because there are a few experiments in rural societies where you have somebody teaching one child and another child is looking on, and a week later that child has learnt the task even though they actually weren't explicitly taught it. Children must learn from other children because most children in the world spend their time in nurseries or running around with other children and not, in fact, in these dyadic one-to-one conversations with their mothers that seem to characterize the way in which we operate. And finally, there's this interesting pattern that you see actually in many societies of repeating back what you hear people say. And that happens in oral societies a lot among adults. So you say something to an adult, they repeat it back to you, which is a way of saying, yes, I've heard you. And what the children in these societies seem to do is to do the same thing. They learn to repeat back initially just a word or two, and then they start to play with it and elaborate language. So the answer is children will find ways that work for their culture, but they may face a lot of challenges when they have to learn the language and ways of other cultures. So if you think about children in England, 39% of children in primary school have a different home language to English. So if you think about what they face when they come into a nursery, it's not just that they have to learn English, which is not as easy a task as you might think, since their languages can often be very, very different, but they also have to work out how the culture works. What do I call this person? I'm not used to having a one-to-one conversation with somebody. Is it okay? How much do children learn by actually watching other children and learning the patterns of behaviour? And these are all things that in LuCiD we're trying to sort out. It's a big challenge because actually working in nurseries and trying to work out what children are learning is nothing like as easy as filming a mother and baby talking to each other. But we hope to have, in the next 5 years, at least have got some way with it. Thank you very much for listening.